These are the spiders in your house.
Hello YouTube. This is one of the most widely studied spiders in existence, which is why it took me so long to make this video. This is a medically significant species, and it lives right alongside us in much of North America, with relatives throughout the world. And while it inspires a lot of fear in many people, understanding can go a long way to alleviating those fears. Meet Latrodectus hesperus, the Western Black Widow. There are actually 3 different kinds of black widow in North America, but they're all pretty similar. I'll be focusing on Latrodectus hesperus, which is the Western black widow, but most of what I say will apply to all 3. I definitely won't use any kind of cheap subliminal messaging tricks to keep you watching. I would never do that. But I will get into the myths and realities, the history of our relationship with this spider, the venom and the bite, and the fascinating mating behavior, which might not be what you think. Some of the common beliefs about this spider are, unsurprisingly, just plain wrong. So I'll do my best to give you the less wronger information, which will be, as we say, more better. And hopefully show you some truly fascinating aspects of this species you never would have guessed. A quick thank you to the people who made this video possible: Catherine Scott, Sean McCann, Spencer Hoffman, Jessica Coles, Mary Lynn Kassam for providing some historical sources, and of course, my wife. All of their contributions were essential to making this video, so thank you. Without further ado, let's get into it. When we call a spider a widow, we're referring to all spiders in the genus Latrodectus, which comes from the Latin latro, meaning robber or bandit, and the ancient Greek dectus, meaning biter, sort of suggesting biting in secret. There are currently 35 accepted species within this genus throughout the world. Now, humanity has known for a really long time that these spiders pack a wallop, with Russian zoologist Yevgeny Pavlovsky reporting several fatalities from widow bites in horses, camels, and cattle in 1927, nearly 100 years ago now. Indigenous peoples in North America knew the widow's bite was a doozy, and actually ground the spiders up to poison their arrows for hunting. Chamberlain and Ivy, in their 1935 work about widows, mention widow species known from Central and South America, New Zealand, Madagascar, and southeastern Europe, all of which were feared by those who lived alongside them. In the early 1900s, North American arachnologists recognized Latrodectus mactans as a species, and as early as 1912, John Henry Comstock was referring to them by the common name Black Widow. What they didn't know then that we do know now is that what they were calling one species was actually 3. This name Black Widow apparently comes from the habit of the female killing and eating the male after mating, but is it perhaps misapplied here? Also, tons of spiders do this, so why did these ones get singled out for it? Not really fair, honestly. That hourglass marking that most widows possess is pretty dramatic and iconic, and pretty much begs for some mythology to be created around it. I've heard that people used to say that the hourglass meant that if you were bitten, you only had an hour to live. This is absolutely not true, by the way. But unlike most kinds of spider that people fear, these ones are actually feared for a somewhat decent reason, because bites from them really do suck. Just how much do they suck? Stick with me, I'll get there. I'm betting you're all waiting for me to make a Scarlett Johansson reference, so let's just check that box right now. Unexpected side note though, the role of Natasha Romanoff was not Johansson's first movie connection with spiders. Despite having seen it in the theater 23 years ago, I didn't realize until I was working on this video that Scarlett Johansson was in the comedy horror 8-Legged Freaks, which, if you've never seen it, is dumb and a lot of fun, and you should actually watch it. Unless the reason you're watching this channel is to try to get over crippling arachnophobia, in which case that movie will not help. Trust me.
Shut up.
I think most people have some idea what a black widow looks like. A black spider with a red hourglass, right? Well, there's a bit more to it than that. What most people are thinking of is generally a mature female Western or Southern black widow. Thing is, this is also a black widow. So is this. This, however, is not a black widow. What are we looking for then? Let's start with the body type. Widows belong to the Therideidae family, which is known as comb-footed spiders or cobweb weavers. Family in biology is a pretty broad classification, so for instance, deer, elk, and moose all belong to the same family. In Therideids, the first pair of legs is the longest, followed by the fourth pair, while the second and third pairs are a lot shorter. Most spiders in this family don't have spines on their legs, while some similar-looking spiders in other families, like this cave orb weaver here, do. And the abdomen is sort of this spherical or globular shape and is usually kinda shiny. And beneath the family level is the genus level, and different genera, which is the plural of genus, we find the common house spider, and notably, the false widows. False widows make up the genus Steatoda, while actual widows form the genus Latrodectus, so they're related but still distinct. And false widows, especially ones like Steatoda grossa here, are easily mistaken for actual widows. However, false widows lack the red or yellow hourglass, and their legs tend to be a bit shorter proportional to their body. A good indicator is these book lung covers here. In Steatoda grossa, they're light colored, while in black widows, they're pretty much black. And false widows lack bright colors, with the exception of Steatoda piculiana here, but it only occurs in Europe. There's a difference in the eye pattern too, though that's a lot harder to see. Widow spiders have 2 rows of 4 eyes that are more evenly spread, while in false widows, these eyes out here, called the lateral eyes, are closer together. But any scenario where you really need to know whether it's a widow or a false widow probably isn't one where you're going to be able to examine the eyes. If you want to learn more about false widows, I've got a video on those. I'll link that here and in the description. The hourglass can be faint, so not seeing one doesn't necessarily mean a spider isn't a widow. But if you do see the distinct hourglass, it's definitely a real widow. I'm focusing on the western black widow, Latrodectus hesperus, in this video, so let's have a good look at Vicky here, who is one of those. You can see she's almost entirely black, except for that hourglass, which in her case is a touch incomplete but still fairly obvious. There are no markings on the top of her abdomen, just black everywhere, except for that belly. They can occasionally have markings on the top here, but they usually don't. A quick glance at iNaturalist, and this is where you'll run into the western black widow. Basically, the western half of the US and the very south of western Canada. How did Vicky end up here in my office in Nova Scotia? That's not important. If we look at the southern black widow, Latrodectus mactans, it's nearly identical, but the bottom triangle of the hourglass is usually a bit wider than the top triangle, and you'll see those in this area, the southeastern quadrant of the US, eastern Mexico, and the Caribbean. The northern black widow, Latrodectus variolus, is again very similar, but more often has markings on the top or dorsal side of the abdomen, and you'll run into these in the eastern US and that little dangly part of Canada that dips below at the 49th parallel. And no, Donald, you can't have that part either. Let's have a look at the males and the juveniles. These are actually brilliantly marked spiders, and the markings can vary a fair bit. But usually, one way or another, you'll see an orange strip or series of marks right down the middle of the abdomen here, outlined in white, and that outlined in black, or just going to a black abdomen. And similarly formed stripes going down the sides here. The abdomen might also be more brown than black, and the males will have yellow parts to their legs, while female legs are completely black. Let's have a quick look at a couple of other widow species. There's the redback in Australia and New Zealand, Latrodectus hasselti. There's the Mediterranean widow, Latrodectus treticimguttatus, in this area here. Here in North America, we've got the brown widow, Latrodectus geometricus, which is neat because it makes these spiky egg sacs just to be different, and also seems to be expanding its territory. Turns out it's better at it than most egomaniacal dictators. Look at the range on this thing. And then you've got this magnificent spider, the red widow, Latrodectus bishopi, and Spencer Hoffman from My Wild Backyard did a great video on these. The red widow exists only in specialized habitat in Florida, and it has the distinction of being the only spider to ever bite and envenomate Spencer Hoffman on camera when he was not trying to get bitten and envenomated by a spider on camera. There are lots of others in the genus, but these are some of the best known ones. So where will you find them? Well, you'll find them around your house, under railings, in little crevices, and especially around outbuildings like garages. They tend to like spots that have a certain geometry, with something they can hide under and attach a cobweb from. So you'll find them in a lot of dark corners, and historically, not to freak you out, but very commonly in outhouses, often making webs right across the hole. Now, most of the time, black widows will make their webs relatively close to the ground, but they can sometimes be found 6 feet or more above it. And the northern black widow has been known to make its web way up in trees, so there's a really wide variety of places you could find them. In particular, places that would provide a sheltered, dark hide are likely sites black widows might make their webs. And what kind of web is that exactly? You will not find a black widow in a web like this. Like all the cobweb weavers of the Theridiidae family, they make these random-looking, messy webs. But they're not random. Turns out there's a method to this madness. These webs are actually carefully engineered structures, but to see that, we need to look closer. It's difficult to make sense of the cobweb, and that makes it hard to appreciate it too. Orb webs we sort of get. They look as though a mathematician, an artist, and a poet all met in a cafe one day, became close friends, and 4 years later unveiled this masterpiece. The cobweb, on the other hand, looks like what you would get if you tied a 14-mile-long piece of string to Sonic the Hedgehog's tail, gave him too much caffeine, and then told him his hair was on fire. And they add to their webs over time, so they get really elaborate. But if we watch how one is constructed from scratch, we start to see a pattern in the chaos. Which is exactly what Suresh Benjamin and Samuel Shaka did in 2002, collecting a number of cobweb weavers of different species, including the brown widow, and filming them as they built webs in captivity. The process usually goes something like this. After walking around and checking out the area, usually at night, the spider picks a point to start from. Then it makes radiating threads from there, which is actually not unlike an orb web, down to the substrate or the ground. Then it uses those as a sort of scaffolding to create more supporting structural lines, usually back up to some piece of terrain. And by adding even more lines, it creates sort of a sheet that extends out over the substrate. In the process, it usually also constructs a retreat, a sort of pocket of silk to hide in near the edge of the web. Now, none of these lines are sticky, but beneath the sheet is the business part of the web. From the sheet to the ground, the spider makes these strands of silk, whose bottom sections are coated in droplets of glue, called gumfoot lines. And they're attached weakly to the ground, or substrate, but are also under tension from the sheet. When a prey insect walks by, it bumps into these gumfoot lines, and two things happen. One, they get stuck to the gumfoot line and struggle to break free. Two, the bond between the gumfoot line and the substrate breaks, and because the line is under tension, it springs up, lifting the prey off the ground. Once it's off the ground, the prey has nothing to grab onto or push against, and the spider rushes out on the underside of the sheet to attack it. It's a pretty clever design, and lends itself to modification and variation, as Jacqueline Zevenbergen, Nicole Schneider, and Todd Blackledge found out. They captured a bunch of western black widows and had them spin webs, but some of them they fed every day, and others they didn't feed for a week. It's fine, spiders do this all the time. A week without food will make them hungry, but it's no big deal. They found that the well-fed spiders built fewer gumfoot lines and added more structural supporting threads instead of a sheet. This is a web designed not to capture more prey, but to protect the spider, providing both a physical barrier to predators and an early warning system for the spider. The hungry spiders made fewer supporting threads, more gumfoot lines, and a more defined sheet, sacrificing a bit of protection to increase their odds of catching more prey. They even tried putting the well-fed spiders onto the webs of the hungry spiders and vice versa, and they found that even the spiders that were full captured more prey on the hungry spider's webs, suggesting that the web architecture itself is responsible for the difference. So hungry spiders build a trap, while full spiders build a fortress. And this variation, or behavioral plasticity as it's called, shows us that the spider is actually making decisions based on the circumstances. Once an insect is unlucky enough to bump into one of these spring-loaded sticky lines, they tend to struggle, and that sends vibrations along the structural threads to alert the spider. And these vibrations tell the spider not just that an insect is in the web, but where in the web it is. And the spider rushes out and starts doing this. What exactly is going on here? There's a description of this from 1936 when Fred DeMoore and his colleagues put one black widow into the web of another black widow who was guarding an egg sac at the time. The two spiders approached each other, and then there was a moment of absolute stillness. Then, with a motion too quick for the eye, the occupant threw a shower of thick, sticky silk, which spurted from the spinnerets at the tip of the abdomen, and was flung over the invader by a skillful manipulation of the hind legs. The victim was rapidly rolled over and over in a net until it was completely covered like a mummy. It was only then, when the risk was past and all secure, that the poison bite was administered. This is the rap attack of the black widow, one it shares with most of the Therideidae family. Two details to note here. One, that the silk is flung, and two, that this is done with the hind legs. Earlier I referred to the Therideidae family as comb-footed spiders, and here's why. This is the last segment or tarsus of the third leg of a western black widow. Note the fine hairs on both sides. This is an image of the tarsus of the fourth leg of the same spider. If you look closely, you can see that this part seems to have an extra row of extra thick hairs, or setae as they're called, that we don't see on the bottom here, and that we didn't see at all on the third leg. This special row of setae is called the tarsal comb, and all spiders in this family have it. In this image by Dr. Sean McCann, if we look really closely, we can see that these setae are actually barbed, and scientists think that these setae are what is used to comb out sticky silk from the spinnerets and actually throw it at prey. The black widow essentially has ranged weapons, and in the invertebrate world, this is a fairly massive advantage. This is a bit different from the way orb weavers attack. Orb weavers wrap their prey in silk using the hind legs, but they use dry silk, not sticky silk, and they sort of roll their prey up like a burrito. Widows can keep even more distance, and they use sticky silk, which is what suggests that this tarsal comb is involved. We still don't completely understand the mechanism here, but I suspect that in the same way that orb weavers use serrated setae to prevent getting stuck to their own webs, cobweb weavers might use this serrated tarsal comb to allow them to throw sticky silk. Once the prey is immobilized, and only then, does the widow actually bite, injecting its powerful venom. How powerful? That is what lies at the root of the black widow's fame and reputation. There's a reason there's no hero called Yellow Sac Spider. There's no warplane called the Long-Jawed Cave Orb Weaver. There's no knife company called Zebra Jumper Knives. But we have examples of all of those things named after this iconic spider. It is nearly synonymous with danger and lethality, and most of us learn to fear its very name from childhood, all on account of what its venom can do, or is believed to do, to a human being. But how can a creature so small create something so powerful that even the minuscule amount held in the spider's tiny venom glands can put a grown adult out of action? Let's find out. Spider venom is complicated. It is a mixture mostly of large neurotoxic polypeptides and smaller biogenic amines and amino acids. Proteolytic enzymes may also be present. Every spider's venom is different and has different effects. Different elements of the venom can actually target different kinds of organisms. The black widow's venom, it turns out, contains 5 different toxins that target insects. These toxins are weirdly specific. One of the insect toxins does next to nothing to wax moth larvae, but the tiniest bit of it kills houseflies dead. Black widows often prey on isopods, but isopods aren't insects, they're actually crustaceans. Guess what? There's a toxin for that. Black widow venom contains one toxin that specifically targets crustacean nervous systems. And in addition to the toxins, there seems to be other substances that on their own aren't toxic, but facilitate the action of the toxins. So it's complicated stuff and probably has even more hard-to-pronounce ingredients than the most highly processed, chemical-laden garbage snack on the shelf at 7-Eleven. Not actually sure which one is worse for you. Thrown into the mix is the toxin we're most worried about. The one that seems specifically designed to target the nervous system of mammals. This is called alpha-latrotoxin, and it is incredible stuff. To understand how alpha-latrotoxin works, first you need to understand how your body works. You have nerves running through your body made up of neurons, carrying information, sending messages, and activating muscles, all using electrical impulses. Where neurons meet is called a synapse, and there's this little gap between them called, you're never going to guess, the synaptic gap. When the neuron receives an electrical impulse, that's sort of an instruction for it to do its thing, and it releases neurotransmitter molecules out into the gap. The neurotransmitters react with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, or receiver, which then fires an electrical impulse down the line, or activates a muscle, or performs some action. Back in 1976, Alan Finkelstein and his team created artificial cell membranes and arranged them between two chambers, filling both with identical solutions of ions. Then they added a tiny bit of black widow venom to one of the chambers, measuring the effect on the membrane and on the solution in the other chamber. They found that alpha-latrotoxin made the membrane particularly permeable to calcium cations. This was the beginning of our understanding as to how this toxin works, by creating a kind of gateway in the wall of a neuron that allows certain ions to flow into it, triggering a massive release of neurotransmitters. This, incidentally, is basically the exact opposite of how tetanus and botulism, including Botox, which is essentially botulism on purpose, work. Those work by blocking neurotransmitters, leading to paralysis, while alpha-latrotoxin sends the neurotransmitters charging off to do their thing like it's a charismatic madman inciting a riot. But how does it do that exactly? This took us a long time to puzzle out, but I'll mention 3 major developments. They are not the only ones. There were a lot of steps and a lot of people involved. So if you're a scientist watching this video who did research on widow venom and I've overlooked your work, I'm sorry, there was a lot of material out there. The first major development came out of Russia. Alpha-latrotoxin is a protein, which is a big long chain of hundreds or thousands of amino acids, all connected in a particular order, which then folds itself up into a certain shape. In 1990, a team at the USSR Academy of Sciences in Moscow, led by N.I. Kyatkin, obtained the total amino acid sequence of alpha-latrotoxin from the Mediterranean widow. This was a big step forward, but we didn't know the shape of the protein or how it interacted with cells. The second major development came 10 years later, when Yelena Orlova and a team at Imperial College in London examined alpha-latrotoxin using cryo-electron microscopy. Because electron microscopes use electrons instead of visible light, they can see details smaller than the smallest wavelengths of visible light. They've actually been around since 1931, believe it or not. Orlova's team found that alpha-latrotoxin starts as one big complex protein molecule called a monomer, and these monomers usually pair up into a bigger molecule called a dimer, which sounds a bit like something you'd buy in a back alley, but let's move on. In the presence of certain ions, though, namely calcium and magnesium ions, these dimers pair up. So now you've got 4 of these molecules getting together like the Power Rangers morphing into the Megazord. This is now called a tetramer. And once this tetramer is formed, the toxin is open for business. At this point, it looks kind of like a 4-bladed propeller with a hole down the middle. Or as my youngest put it, it looks sort of like a Beyblade, really. Orlova's imaging showed that a part of the molecule clearly penetrated cell membranes, but we still were a little unclear on exactly how. A third major step forward came in 2024, by which point electron microscopes had reached the point where we could image things near the level of individual atoms. And in 2020, an AI system called AlphaFold was developed by Google DeepMind that could accurately predict the three-dimensional shape of protein structures when given the amino acid sequence, which we had, thanks to Kiatkin's work in Russia 30 years earlier. This, by the way, is the kind of thing we should be using AI for, folks. It shouldn't be creating art. Like this love letter from a millipede to a stapler that I asked ChatGPT to write, before I realized that just having it do that would use up enough electricity to power the light show at a Taylor Swift concert. It was kind of a sweet letter, though. No, bad human. Don't make robots make art. Using the new electron microscopes, a team led by Bjorn Klink at the University of Munster in Germany was able to get high-resolution images of the toxin, and at the same time, they entered the amino acid sequence into AlphaFold, which was AlphaFold 2 by then, to see what shape and function the computer simulation came up with. Both methods presented some challenges, but the results were enough to suggest some really wild stuff, and they published their findings in 2024. Once the 4 copies of the alpha-latrotoxin monomer morphed together into their super-duper tetramer Zord thing, it looks kind of like this, and there are strings of the protein all coiled up inside other sections. This is called the pre-pore state. But this tetramer waits for a signal from a calcium ion, which it will encounter when it's pumped into the body of a human, and when it gets that signal, something incredible happens. Sections from each of the 4 monomers that make up the tetramer unfold from the inside and interact with each other to create this stalk with this structure on the end. This is the pore state. And that structure just happens to bind to certain components of a cell membrane, allowing it to insert itself into the wall of a neuron. And the structure itself contains channels that have just the right chemical properties and electrical charges to suck up calcium ions from the synaptic gap outside the neuron and pump them straight in while ignoring everything else. And those calcium ions trigger a massive, uncontrolled release of neurotransmitters by the neuron into the synaptic gap, which doesn't just fire the nerve, but fires it pretty much as hard as it can. And on a person, that looks like incredible pain and uncontrollable muscle contractions. So this protein, this incredible molecule, is a machine that is a drill, a plug, a pump, and a filter all at the same time, and it's made to target the nerves of mammals. Now that we know how the venom works, how and when does the spider actually use it? Obviously, it's used in killing prey, and I think we're all cool with that, right? Are we? We're all good with spiders eating bugs, right? Yeah? Okay. What most of us would want to know is how likely the spider is to use its venom on us. And it turns out, black widows put more thought into this than we might initially suppose. In 2014, David Nelson, Wayne Kellen, and William Hayes thought it would be fun to scare the pants off some black widows and see how they responded. I love this detail they include in their paper, though. Great care was taken to minimize permanent harm and suffering experienced by the spiders used in these experiments. Isn't that nice? 43 black widows were collected in California and allowed to make webs and enclosures. Then the team pestered them in different ways using fake fingers made out of Knox gelatin. This is a lot like the cheese test I've done in other videos where I chase spiders around with a piece of cheese to see if they'll bite, except it's more science-y. You can tell it's science-y because they included the recipe for the fingers. To simulate low threat, they gave the spiders a 1-second prod while the spiders were in their home webs. 84% of them just moved away, while a handful of them bunched up and retracted their legs, and just a few flicked silk at the evil gelatin finger, and not a single one bit. For a medium threat, they gave the spider 60 brief prods, 1 per second, for 1 minute, also in the spider's home web. In all cases, the spiders ran away, but more than half of them started flicking silk at the finger, and one of them did actually bite. Keep in mind that's one spider out of the 43 they tried this nonsense on. For a high threat, they coaxed the spider to crawl right onto one of the gelatin fingers, then gave the spider 3 gentle, whole-body pinches, each lasting 10 seconds. Unsurprisingly, the spiders always tried to get away, often dropping to the floor, so retreating was their first option. But nearly half of them tried flicking silk, a few played dead, and 60% of them eventually did bite, and bit an average of 2.7 times. So we can see that black widows do a kind of risk assessment. They don't just have a single programmed defensive behavior. They evaluate how much danger they think they're in and respond from there. This makes sense, as the more forceful responses have higher costs. Silk and venom are both finite resources that require proteins for the spider to produce, so it doesn't want to waste them if it doesn't have to. That was experiment 1. There was also an experiment 2. Nelson's team took some little centrifuge vials and over their openings stretched a single layer of this stuff called parafilm, which is kind of like plastic wrap, but not really. Look it up. I did. It's neat stuff, actually. It's used in labs a lot. Then they either chased the spider to the top of its container with forceps and gave its leg a pinch, or grabbed it by the abdomen with their hands while wearing a glove. And while the spiders were being pinched like that, the little parafilm-covered vials were shoved at their faces. This allowed the scientists to actually recover the venom from the bites and measure how much the spiders had dispensed. The results from this were kind of complicated because there were 3 variables: how many times the spiders bit, how much venom they injected per bite, and how much venom they injected in total. To summarize it, when the spiders were pinched on the leg, they usually injected some venom the first time they were pinched, but less venom on subsequent pinches, which sort of tracks since the spider can afford to lose a leg. And many of those bites appeared to be dry bites, bites where no venom was injected at all. But when they were pinched on the abdomen, which is a much more life-threatening scenario for the spider, they used more and more venom each time they were pinched, and the amount of venom they expended per bite was nearly double that of when they were pinched on the leg. The upshot of all this is that the spiders are not just deciding when to bite, but they're making deliberate decisions about how much venom to use based on the perceived threat. Again, just like we saw in web building, this shows behavioral plasticity. These spiders have got more going on upstairs than many people would give them credit for. Biting for the black widow is a last resort, and against a predator it probably wouldn't get a chance to bite anyway. But that same sticky silk that they use when attacking prey is a surprisingly effective defense, and you can see it here. Those droplets are the gluey stuff. In 1980, Rick Vedder, best known today for his work on the brown recluse, studied widow defensive behavior and its effectiveness against mice, looking especially at the sticky silk they emit when threatened. Turns out mice hate this stuff, and when attacked by mice, the spiders would often make a strand of it and stick it on the mouse's face and front paws. The mice immediately retreated and started tugging frantically at their fur. This response wasn't elicited when non-sticky dragline silk was applied to mice. It was specifically this sticky stuff. The reality is that black widows are actually very unlikely to bite humans, unless they're being squished in some way. And that's an unlikely scenario, as these are web-building spiders that stay put. They don't hide in shoes or piles of clothing like some other spiders might. Most of the time, if you know the spider's there and you don't pinch it, you're really in no danger at all. You could even have one crawling on you and you'd most likely be fine. Okay then, Travis, you might say, put your money where your mouth is and play with Vicky. Here's the thing. There are exactly 2 reasons to film yourself free-handling a black widow and put it on YouTube. One of them is legitimate, and the other one sucks. The terrible reason is to be macho and try to prove how brave and fearless and stupid you are. The good reason is to demonstrate that these spiders really aren't looking to bite. And that's a worthwhile demonstration. The thing is, it's been done plenty of times, and while it generally makes the point, it's not completely without risk. In the end, spiders are not actually all that different from us, which means once in a while you might get one that's just a jerk. Which might explain what happened to Spencer Hoffman from My Wild Backyard when he was filming This Red Widow in Florida.
I don't care what you say. These spiders. Ow! What happened? Bit me.
Nobody who regularly deals with widows actually saw that coming.
Like that was what was really strange about this red widow bite. Is like, of course you get the comments who are like, haha, serves you right because you were working with a dangerous spider. But like, it was like, not only was I not free handling the spider when it bit me, it came off of the stick to bite me. Because I'm like, oh, okay, because I've handled these before. I'm like, no big deal. I'm like, sure. And then, whoa, what the heck was that?
Yeah, and you took it right on the knuckle.
Yep, right there.
Which apparently is lucky, because what I'm reading, especially in Days Gone By, of what the typical bite case was, I mean, it's sort of hilarious and also horrifying. I mean, could you imagine? Could you imagine? I mean, having gone through what you did you ever get to any kind of conclusion about what happened that made this spider bite?
Everything I have is completely speculation because there's so little study on these spiders, there's so little data on them. My biggest guess is I think behaviorally they're a little different than other widows. And this is mostly off of, again, like chats with Mikey, because Mikey lives right by
right there,
a hot spot for them, so he actually actively researches them. He mentioned that in a lot of cases where he is initially handling them, they do tend to dry bite a lot. I've seen them do a lot of that, and I wonder if, because of their bright coloration and living in a much more exposed environment compared to like typical Latrodectus, I almost wonder if they're more prone to biting because of, it to me, it almost reminds me a little bit of like the monarch butterfly effect, right? So, and this is all speculative, but I wonder if there is any truth to their venom causing chronic effects. I almost wonder if, rather than trying to kill an attacker or severely injure it, they want to just leave a lasting impression.
There are exceptional circumstances that might make a black widow more inclined to choose violence, though, as Dr. Catherine Scott found out while collecting Western black widows for research. So you got bitten by a black widow. How did this occur? What were you doing to this black widow at the time, or trying to do when this bite happened?
The particular spider that ended up biting me was a female who had been collected alongside of 2 egg sacs.
Oh.
And between the time that I had collected her into that vial with her egg sacs and then got back to where I was transferring them into containers, one of the egg sacs had hatched. So I had a vial with an adult female black widow, 1 egg sac with eggs inside, and then about 100 spiderlings.
Like a billion little black widow spiderlings. Okay.
And so I wanted to very quickly scoop out the intact egg sac to put that into its own container.
Okay.
And then get the female out and put her into her own container. And then hopefully, before all of the little baby spiders had started crawling out and getting everywhere.
That's like putting toothpaste back in the tube at that point.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I was holding the tube in one hand and kind of trying to work very quickly, grabbing the egg sac with forceps, pulling it out. And of course, there's silk in there. And spiderlings connected to it. And female black widows are quite protective of their offspring, and they don't like it when you mess with their egg sacs. And so when I pulled out that egg sac, I kind of pulled out the female spider with it, not entirely, but she was kind of following it up, like, what are you doing? Why are you stealing my babies from me? And so with one hand, I was moving the egg sac over here, and then my other hand, where I was holding the vial, she just crawled out over the lip and bit my finger.
Okay. So she wasn't wasting any time at that point.
No.
Right.
So I was really surprised by this. I actually, because I noticed her crawling out onto my finger, And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. I have handled black widows with my bare hands before. I've never had any issues because I always assumed, they're crawling on me. I am the substrate. But instead of continuing on her way and walking on my finger, she just stood there and with her fangs down. And I was like, in my head, I'm not being bitten right now, am I? She couldn't possibly be biting me. No, this is not happening. And then eventually she did start moving again. I got her off. I put her in her own container. I dealt with all the baby spiders that were trying to escape everywhere. And then started wondering what was going to happen next and hoping that it was going to be a dry bite or not a severe envenomation.
Did you have previous experience that made you think, okay, this is fine?
So yeah, this whole situation grew out of me being overly confident and foolish, as it turns out, in terms of thinking that it was not a big deal to be doing this, not wearing gloves, not taking extra precautions. Like I said, I have handled black widows before. I've gone out into the field and sort of, like put my hand in front of one, coaxed the spider to walk onto my hand, and then had her just kind of treadmilling across my hands and stuff. I've done that. I've done that to show people that black widows are not aggressive. So I was surprised that this spider, when I threatened her and took her egg sac from her, which she didn't like, her first response was to bite in defense.
Right.
So in retrospect, I was asking for it. I was
right.
The ways to get a black widow to defend themselves are to sort of squish them against your body, or repeatedly poke and prod and pinch them. Although their first lines of defense are usually, they escalate from like running away to throwing silk as a last resort, which I've experienced many times. I've also shown people like, oh, here's what happens if I poke her. She's just gonna like run away, or maybe wrap my finger with silk. She's not gonna turn around and bite me.
So we've got a bit of a just because you can doesn't mean you should scenario here. If you want to see widows getting handled, a lot of folks have done this demonstration, so there's not a lot of need for me to do it again. And the point isn't go ahead and cuddle with widows. The point is you don't need to panic if you find yourself beside one. The handling demonstrations are a way of showing that even under extreme circumstances, which should never happen, these spiders still don't really want to bite. But what happens if they do? This is one of the most notorious spiders in the world, known for its potent venom. So what is a black widow bite actually like? The bite itself is often not really that painful. Some people don't even realize they've been bitten at first. And it's believed that's where the name Latrodectus, meaning biting in secret, comes from. But the bites to worry about, the bites that they're known for, are specifically the bites from the mature females. Mostly because the females are much larger, and not only more likely to have fangs large enough to actually pierce the skin, but they're also going to deliver a much bigger dose of the venom. Perhaps this spider's bite is believed to be worse than it actually is, thanks to some of our early attempts to treat it. For instance, the case of George Schertz, who suffered a black widow bite 125 years ago. This part is going to test the limits of my professionalism. The notes of Dr. George Crook Clark, who was called on to treat the patient, read, "I was called July 26, 1900 to see G.S. about 1:15 p.m., who stated that he had been bitten on the penis by a spider while in an outhouse a few minutes before. Was suffering great pain in the penis." It turns out that men using outhouses was actually the typical bite scenario at the time, accounting for the vast majority of bite cases, and one study found black widows under the seats of 3/4 of the outhouses that were checked in Southern California. And this occasionally still happens today, resulting in this headline in Australia in 2016. Happened to the same poor dude twice in 5 months. Anyway, back to George Schertz. He initially presented with the same symptoms we read about today, like extreme pain and nausea. And anxiety. George was convinced he was going to die, which may have become a self-fulfilling prophecy. As we really didn't know how to deal with this back then, Dr. Clark treated Schertz by focusing on preventing infection and relieving the severe pain. So he applied potassium permanganate as an antiseptic, and for the pain, an 8% cocaine solution directly on the affected area. Apparently this didn't help a whole lot, so the patient, in a moment of terribly misguided initiative, took control of the situation and slammed back 6 ounces of whiskey. And 45 minutes later, 6 more. With the pain continuing, Dr. Clark gave him an injection of morphine, atropine, and potassium permanganate, and less than an hour later gave him the same injection again. Shortly after that, Schertz put back yet more whiskey, and since he seemed a bit more relaxed at that point, can't think why, the doctor went to check on another patient. 15 minutes later, Schertz fell asleep and apparently turned cyanotic, meaning bluish, indicating a lack of oxygen. Dr. Clark tried to revive him with smelling salts, but when that failed, he threw a final medical Hail Mary to save the unlucky fellow by injecting, get this, strychnine and more whiskey. Yes, injected the whiskey this time, and freely, apparently. Just get that booze straight in there, that ought to do it. Shockingly, the patient did not survive these medical treatments, I mean the spider bite, expiring 14 hours after having been bitten. Naturally, everyone figured the spider's venom was responsible for his death, because, I mean, what else could it have been? And I thought the rubbing gasoline on the bite thing from the Yellow Garden Spider video was crazy. Thereafter, the Black Widow had a reputation as deadly. But what happens in the case of a widow bite when we do not that? You won't believe this, but it actually gets better.
The spider gave me this little bite, and I was waiting for 5 or 10 minutes, kind of wondering, okay, is it going to start hurting? Was I envenomated? Do I need to start considering medical attention or not? And after 5 minutes or so, it started to hurt. And I think it was similar to a wasp sting, a throbbing pain, not particularly comfortable, but not unbearable. So between the time that I got bitten or it started to hurt and I ended up going to the emergency room, that was probably maybe an hour past. And by that time, my armpit had started to hurt and my finger was throbbing. It was painful, like a really bad wasp sting, but then also this my pain far from the bite site. So at the hospital, I was examined. They weren't particularly concerned. I also wasn't particularly concerned. I was like, right. I think I'm going to be fine. I know what the typical symptoms of a black widow bite are. You're not going to need to give me antivenom. And so they made sure that my breathing was fine and that my heart was fine. And then they sent me home with no treatment. The rest of the day, gradually, it became more painful. I had cramps. And over the course of the first night, I would say was the most unpleasant in terms of pain. It was like having a really bad flu, where you just can't get comfortable, like your back hurts, like everything kind of hurts. I might have taken some Advil, but it wasn't I wasn't treated with anything. I wasn't given any particular drugs for the pain. But I believe it was the first night. I think that is also when the sweating started. And when I say profuse sweating, that doesn't do it justice. You do not understand how much it is possible to sweat over every surface of your body continuously for almost 3 days. At night, I soaked through all of my pajamas, my bedding. I ended up multiple times a night having to put a towel down below me, put on new pajamas, put another towel above me, go back to sleep, and then a few hours later, I would wake up and everything was completely soaked again. And so I was just chugging water and Gatorade and stuff, trying to remain hydrated. But I sweated more than you can imagine for almost 3 days. After the first night, the cramps subsided. I wasn't in that much pain anymore. I did have weird tingling in my fingers and toes. and kind of these like pains occasionally in like parts of my body that were nowhere near where I had been bitten. After 3 days, I basically didn't have any acute symptoms anymore. It might have been 4 or 5 days before I stopped having these like weird little tingles, and mostly my toes. That was not my fingers, because my finger was where I would expect to feel pain. It was in like the other extremities. I know I have read like people having excruciating pain.
Right.
And while it wasn't pleasant, like I don't recommend it. It wasn't a particularly fun experience. It wasn't unbearable. Like I said, like a really bad flu where just like kind of everything hurts.
Spencer's bite from the red widow was a bit remarkable because there are very, very few confirmed bites on record from this particular species, since they inhabit very specific habitat that humans don't generally spend time in. But it is a Latrodectus species, so we'd expect similar results. And
for me, I got a pinch and release because as soon as I felt that sting, I'm like, oh, get off of me. So like,
yeah,
I got a little bit of a localized, like just kind of muscle aches, like I'd gone to the gym really hard the day before. And then after about 12 hours, like there was nothing. I was like tired, maybe a little sore the next couple of days, but like, it wasn't, I haven't had any symptoms that have persisted past that first 12-hour period.
It's really unclear why that spider bit Spencer. There's no obvious stimuli.
I have colleagues who study behavioral syndromes or animal personalities in black widows, and they're not all the same. Some of them are more bold, some of them are more shy.
A black widow bite might not actually be all that bad, providing apparently that you don't combine it with, alcohol poisoning. It can be incredibly painful in some cases, though. In 1934, Dr. Alan Walker Blair, who was a physician at the University of Alabama at the time, turns out he was actually Canadian though, wanted to see if one could develop an immunity to the bite. His plan was to get bitten on purpose multiple times and document the symptoms.
This is a very dumb thing to do.
But he suffered from severe back and abdominal pain, rigidity in the abdomen, profuse sweating, and a feeling that he was going insane that was so intense that his assistants had to take over documenting the symptoms as he was hospitalized. He turned the corner after a couple of days and went home, but the experience sucked so hard that he couldn't bring himself to get bitten again, and he abandoned the experiment. In fact, the doctor who treated him wrote, "I do not recall having seen more abject pain manifested in any other medical or surgical condition." Even worse than man flu. Shortly after that, Blair left Alabama, where there are black widows, and returned to Canada, where there generally are not. Though that might be unrelated. But could it be fatal? Over the years, we've done enough research on venoms to know that drop for drop, black widow venom is several times more lethal than rattlesnake venom. But it's a much, much smaller animal, so there's much less of it injected in a bite. If you go Googling to find out how many people actually die from widow bites, the results are sort of all over the map. There were two predominant claims that repeatedly kept coming up for me. The first was that the last black widow fatality in the US occurred in 1983. So where did that come from? That seems to trace back to Wikipedia, which actually says that there have been no black widow fatalities reported to poison control in the US since 1983. It doesn't say there was a fatality in 1983, and I'm pretty sure that even that is a misinterpretation of the report it cites. I discussed that on Patreon. The second claim is that 5% of bite cases were lethal, and I was able to trace that back to Thorpe and Woodson's Black Widow, America's Most Poisonous Spider, which was published in 1945, and yeah, 80 years ago that might have been close to true, but it isn't today. As early as 1970, it had dropped to less than 1%. And this alleged bite case in 2011, while tragic, looks unlikely. While it's possible, no bite was confirmed, I don't see any mention of typical envenomation symptoms like the rigid abdomen, and the ultimate cause of death appeared to actually be a streptococcus infection, so I don't think I'd blame a spider for this one. All of this data was a bit of a mess, but I went back through the annual reports of the American Association of Poison Control Centers, one by one, back to 2011, and there were no reported Black Widow fatalities. This paper had gone through the 1999 to 2010 reports, which also showed no fatalities. And in each of those years, there were 1,000 to 2,000 recorded bites. So we've got a pretty solid 25-year history with around 40,000 reported Black Widow bites with no recorded fatalities. This lack of fatalities is most likely attributable to an effective antivenom. Antivenom is made by putting a small dose of the venom into horses, whose powerful immune systems develop antibodies that can fight the venom. Then serum containing the antibodies is taken from the horse's blood, purified, and sterilized. Scientists have been messing with Black Widow antivenom since 1926, and it's been commercially produced since 1936, so we've been at this nearly 100 years now. But the antivenom is only given in the most severe cases, since there's a very slight risk of anaphylaxis. Of the 25,000 reported Black Widow bites in the US between 2000 and 2009, 554 of them were treated with antivenom. There were no fatalities from the venom. In 2011, a 37-year-old man who received the antivenom did go into anaphylactic shock, which created other complications that ultimately resulted in his death. But that's the only case I could find over decades of using the antivenom to save countless lives. So if you or someone you love gets bitten by a Black Widow, don't panic, they're probably going to be okay. They should probably see a doctor and they're going to have a rough few days, but they'll get better. If someone you hate gets bitten by a Black Widow, tell them to see a doctor, you're not a monster. But you could also tell them that rubbing raw egg yolks and garlic in their hair might alleviate the symptoms. It definitely won't, but they probably don't know that. Finding good data about spider bites on pets is usually really difficult. But in the case of Black Widows and their relatives, we do have some studies. Strangely, horses, cows, and sheep are actually more sensitive to the venom than humans are, while rats, rabbits, dogs, and goats are more resistant to it. The news isn't great for cats, I'm afraid. Cats are particularly sensitive to Latrodectus venom, and are unlikely to survive an envenomation without treatment. They'll howl in pain, be restless, salivate excessively, and probably vomit, sometimes puking up the spider itself. The recommended treatment for cats is actually antivenom, which is apparently inexpensive and easy to stock. So I expected that vet clinics in widow territory would probably have it on hand, but the couple I reached out to actually didn't. So if you're concerned about Mr. Bigglesworth, give your vet a call and ask if they're equipped to treat a Black Widow bite. For Black Widows, the process of making babies is complicated, so...
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
What you're getting here is a much condensed version of what I originally wrote. And if you're interested in the details, say so in the comments, because Black Widow dating and mating and how we figured it all out could be its own video. The story begins in late summer, when males, who up until this point have just been living their lives on their own webs, hit maturity and their priorities change dramatically. They leave their webs, stop eating, abandon all of their hobbies, stop calling their friends, and set out with one purpose: finding females. When you're 3/4 of an inch long, though, the world is a big place, full of obstacles and dangers, and also, Black Widows are functionally blind. So how do they even find these females? As with most spiders, pheromones play a large role here, but they're not the whole picture. In 2016 and 2017, Catherine Scott, Sean McCann, and Madiane Andrade set up what was basically a Black Widow Amazing Race situation. In an area with no widows, they placed some caged females in a line and released a bunch of males at varying distances on a perpendicular line downwind of the females. They found that even when the wind stopped or changed direction, males from 200 feet away could still find their way to females, and covered ground more quickly than males released closer. And it was because those males were actually using the silk drag lines of other males, which often acted like bridges over rough terrain. It's kind of cheating, but hey, in this economy you take whatever breaks you can get. And it's a pretty bad economy for boy spiders. At the peak of the season, the ratio of male to female widows is between 5-1 and 20-1, so competition is fierce. And the journey is perilous. By marking and tracking wild males, the team found that only 12% of male widows survived the trip to find a mate. So they may as well piggyback off the efforts of other males. For all the spider knows, the dude whose trail he was following might have been eaten just before he got to a lady widow. Or possibly by the lady widow herself. How often, though, does the female black widow actually kill the male after mating? Latrodectus hesselti, the Australian redback, does this pretty much all of the time, and in fact, the males are on board with it. During mating, male redbacks actually position their abdomen right in front of the female's jaws and offer themselves to be eaten. This actually results in them fertilizing more eggs, and the female rejecting subsequent males, so it's beneficial from a paternity standpoint. But in our western black widow here, Latrodectus hesperus, the female killing and eating the male after mating is actually kinda rare, and lab experiments with all 3 North American black widow species have shown that it happens only occasionally. Back in 1936, De Moore noted that male widows left in enclosures with females after mating were later found dead, but that it was likely the result of natural causes, writing, "It seems quite possible that the widow may be a relict not as a result of her own criminal propensities, but from natural causes alone." Before mating, on the other hand, can be a bit of a different story. If the female is particularly hungry, the male may want to think twice about trying his luck. Ha! How about that? In 2011, J. Chadwick Johnson and a team at Arizona State University tried introducing males to female black widows that were well fed and females that hadn't eaten in a while and were pretty hungry. None of the well-fed females attacked males when they approached and courted, but 5 out of the 7 very hungry females did, and 2 of them successfully killed the males. There's a bit of good news for the fellows though. They can actually tell how well-fed a female is from the pheromones in the silk and on the female. And Johnson's team found that males courted well-fed, happy females a lot more than they courted hungry, grumpy ones. We might think that this was just because well-fed females would probably produce more eggs. But in 2014, Luciana Barafaldi and Median Andrade at the University of Toronto found that while male Western black widows, who can mate more than once, showed 3 times more courtship behavior on the silk of well-fed females, it made no difference to Australian redback males, who literally count on being killed and eaten after mating only once. So it seems that black widow males aren't just trying to have lots of kids, they're trying to survive this brutal dating scene. But let's say a lucky male has made his way to the web of a well-fed female who could possibly be convinced to make some babies. Buddy has just crossed the equivalent of miles of rough, treacherous terrain, evading predators that all want to kill him, just to even get here, but he's still got to play his cards right at this point. Step 1 is getting close enough to miss right without being mistaken for prey. This is done by creating vibrations in the web. In 2014, Samantha Vibert, Catherine Scott, and Gerhard Gries at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia recorded and analyzed the vibrations made by male black widows on unoccupied females' webs, and compared them to those of prey using a laser Doppler vibrometer. Then they played those back through the webs of females to test their responses. They found that females rarely responded aggressively to low-amplitude, quiet signals, but readily attacked high-amplitude ones. So a belligerent loudmouth will get chased off, but a smooth-talking whisperer might get a girl interested. And this particular behavior that males engage in, shaking their abdomen up and down like this, generated a unique signal that was both quiet and very consistent. They're basically twerking. Look at this guy go. 6 years later, Sentharin Savalium and Andrew Mason at the University of Toronto looked at this again, this time using not just a laser vibrometer to record the vibrations, but high-speed videography as well, to better see exactly what was going on through the whole mating process. And wouldn't you know it, some patterns emerged. Male black widows actually have 3 main mechanisms to create vibrations through the web. The abdominal tremulation, it's just twerking, bouncing, which is when the spider quickly pulls his entire body down and strikes the web with his belly, and plucking, which is what it sounds like, plucking strands of web with his legs. In the early stages of courtship, which they call the distal phase, when the male is still a ways away from the female, he seems to do these 3 things sort of randomly. But once the male manages to actually make contact with the female, which marks the beginning of what they call the proximal phase, he switches to stereotyped structured signaling. He begins by freezing, stopping all movement completely. Then he does the butt-shaking thing, followed by an intense bounce, followed by a series of web plucks. All of the males Savalium and Mason tested produced this specific sequence of signals. And once actual mating began, this set was the only signal they produced. Almost like a song.
Shaky, 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 and a bounce, pluck, pluck, and shaky, 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 and a bounce, pluck, pluck. I don't want to get eaten, so wish me good luck, and shaky, shaky, shaky. Wow, no!
It doesn't always work. They also found that the signal power of the bounce and web pluck signals directly correlated to the size of the male. The bigger the spider, the more powerful those elements of the signal were, which means that females could possibly be determining the size of the male from those signals alone, without actually having to get near him. In the middle of all of this is another behavior that baffled scientists for quite a while. Most of the time, before they actually approach the female herself, male widows will cut sections of her web and bundle them up in their own silk. In 2012, Catherine Scott, Samantha Weber, and Gerhard Gries found that the males that did this encountered a lot less aggression from the females, only 3 instances on average versus the 19 experienced by the lazy guys who didn't bother. So once again, this looks a lot like a measure males take to avoid getting unalived. It also reduces the time it took for the females to settle down and accept the male's advances, remaining motionless to indicate acceptance. This is called quiescence. In 2019, Nicholas DiRienzo and a team at the University of Arizona collected some females and rated how aggressively each one responded to prey signals. Then they sent some males in to try to woo them, and they found that the more aggressive she was, the more of her silk the guy bundled up. And the more of her silk he bundled up, the more likely he was to successfully mate. There seems to be a second purpose to this, though. In 2015, Catherine Scott and a team at Simon Fraser University put some female widow webs out in black widow territory and found that webs that had been reduced by males attracted 3 times fewer other males than webs that had been reduced artificially. Female widows can mate more than once, but the male wants her eggs to be his kids, not some other guy's. And it's thought that by bundling up the female's silk, the males contain the female's pheromones and cover them with their own, limiting competition from other males. When she rebuilds the web after mating, she no longer puts those pheromones into the silk, so additional males are unlikely to find her. The last thing males do to avoid dying in the pursuit of siring offspring is often to throw a bunch of silk over the female herself. This is known as the bridal veil, and we're not completely sure what it does, since it usually doesn't look strong enough to really restrict her. But the going guess is that the bridal veil likely contains male pheromones that further reduce the female's aggressive instincts, or criminal propensities. Then comes the actual mating. The male does this with his pedipalps, which have special coiled structures on them that actually fit the internal structure of the female's reproductive organs like a key in a lock. This secret key shape mostly keeps spiders from breeding outside their own species. This is how sperm is transferred from the male into the female, And when that's done, the male often breaks off a part of that coil inside the female. This becomes what's called a mating plug and prevents other males from fertilizing that same female's eggs, which is horrifying. I'm planning to do a video all about how spiders actually mate, so watch for that in the future where I'll provide more detail about all of that. Once the mating is done, the male goes on his way and dies not too long after. The female, however, is stuck with the task of building an egg sac and filling it with eggs. Usually that's 100 to 400 of them, and they'll guard these egg sacs ferociously, as Catherine found out. And Phil Rao in 1924 documented the curious case of a black widow that seemed to have moved her egg sac out of her own web and discarded it, only to recover it 2.5 days later and be found clinging tenaciously to it. 20 to 30 days after the egg sac is made, the spiderlings emerge. As many spiders do, the spiderlings will often eat each other initially. Weed out the weaklings! But soon enough, they disperse by ballooning, letting out a strand of thread that actually interacts with electric fields in the air to lift the spider off the ground so it can be carried by the wind. After that, it's a complete lottery where the little spiderling lands, and hopefully it can establish a web. Generally in nature, spiders have a very high mortality rate, and it's estimated fewer than 1% of them will actually survive to adulthood. So, what's killing so many of them? When black widows have nightmares, what do they dream of? The black widow's fearsome reputation could easily make us think that nothing out there would ever mess with them. But it turns out quite a lot of animals can, and do, pick that fight and win it. Going back to Damour's account from 1936, many birds not only eat them, but feed them to their young. He writes, "Pigeons and chickens may eat it with impunity, the latter with apparent relish." Small rodents, reptiles, and amphibians are all known to eat them, as well as eating their eggs. But weirdly, if you inject the eggs into the bloodstream of mice, the eggs are lethal to them. And it isn't because of the venom. The toxin that does this is entirely different, and we don't understand why it's even there, as there's nobody out there in nature putting spider eggs in syringes and shooting them into mice. Some lizards in the western US can not only eat them, but appear to be resistant to being bitten by them. Some insects actually prey on them as well, notably the blue mud dauber wasp. This is what's known as a parasitoid wasp. It stings and paralyzes the spider, then takes it back to its nest and lays eggs on it, which then hatch and feed on the luckless spider. But in a dramatic twist, the greatest enemy of the black widow in North America just might be one of its own close family members. Latrodectus geometricus, the brown widow. The brown widow is believed to be originally native to Africa, but in 1935 it was recorded for the first time in North America. For decades it remained restricted to the Florida peninsula, but in the first decade of the 21st century something happened. It ventured forth into the country like the Roman Empire into Europe. And by 2011, it was established in the southeastern states, from Texas to South Carolina. And looking at INAT and filtering for research grade, this appears to be its current distribution in the US. And not only does the brown widow seem to be expanding its territory, it's wiping out the black widows in that territory, specifically in urban areas. In 2023, Lou Caticcio, Rick Vetter, and Debbie Castle surveyed some sites in Florida and found that in urban and parkland structures, the brown widow outnumbered the black widow, in this case the southern black widow, Latrodectus mactans, by 20 to 1. And they wanted to know what made it so adept at eradicating these southern black widows. Turns out, the brown widow reproduces at roughly twice the rate, producing multiple egg sacs at a time, while the southern black widow produces only one. But reproduction alone didn't account for the massacre. When we look at patterns around how the brown widow interacts with other species, it almost seems personal, especially at the subadult life stage. When paired with subadult red house spiders, subadult brown widows peacefully coexisted about half the time, and 40% of the time got eaten. When paired with triangulate cobweb weavers, brown widows peacefully cohabited 80% of the time, got eaten 10% of the time, and ate the other 10% of the time. But when paired with southern black widows, the brown widow actively stalked, killed, and ate the black widow 80% of the time. Black widows were never seen to be the aggressors in these contests. When they did succeed in killing brown widows, it was always in self-defense. We're not sure why the brown widow seems to target black widows, while it gets along just fine with triangulate cobweb weavers, which are very similar spiders in the same family. But there appears to be some kind of difference in temperament. The triangulate cobweb weaver, red house spider, and brown widow were all characterized as bold, while the black widow seemed to be shy. In stark contrast to this invading brown widow, we have the red widow, Latrodectus bishopi, which may have taken a chomp out of our boy Spencer here, but otherwise seems to desperately just want to be left alone. And the greatest threat to this species is unquestionably us. The red widow lives in threatened palmetto scrub on ancient sand ridges in Florida, and literally nowhere else in the world, which makes it a very vulnerable species. A lot of that habitat is in Jonathan Dickinson State Park, but when some developers came along last year and decided it would be a great idea to erase that scrubland to put in more golf courses and pickleball courts, in a protected state park, remember, the red widow's very existence on this planet was at risk. Turns out this has happened a few times in Florida. But grassroots efforts managed to sound the alarm that this was going on. People mobilized on social media, a petition was started, and in the end, thanks to public pressure from people like you, the development project was actually scrapped, and the red widow got to peacefully carry on its existence. That's what I can tell you about the black widow, while touching on a couple of its close cousins. Widows in general are fascinating, beautiful spiders, and this video was tough to write because there's just so much that has been written about them. As a common and medically significant spider, we have studied them a lot. But beyond what we can learn about these incredible spiders, I think there are a couple of things that we can learn from them as well. I don't usually take things in too personal a direction in these videos, but it seems like if ever there was a time to do it, this is it. So here we go. First, don't try to flirt with someone when they're hungry. Absolutely nobody is at their best in that state, and it's almost definitely going to go badly. Just get them something to eat first. Second, the case of the red widow in Florida showed us that despite everything we read while we're doom scrolling, enough people speaking up together can actually make a difference. Enough folks spoke up to save the palmetto scrub in Florida, and very likely saved the red widow. For now. Stay tuned, because frankly I think it's very likely that we're going to need to again. But the takeaway should be that while it's tempting to throw our hands in the air and believe there's nothing we can do to steer the ship, the reality is that enough people speaking up actually does make a difference. This showed us what was possible when we all use what we've got. It's what happens when a whole lot of people take just a little time to make that call, send that email, write that post, shoot that reel, click share. These things can and will literally shape the future, so all of your voices matter. And on a more individual level, I think all of us at some point have felt like maybe the world doesn't get some part of us, whether it's why we care about a certain thing that they don't think matters, or our creative projects, or just who we are as human beings. Spiders, I think, can help us be okay with that. To our human eyes, the webs these widows make are chaotic and senseless, and yet those webs catch prey, they provide refuge, they work for the spider, and the spider understands them. Jessica Coles, a poet who has been a friend of mine for over 25 years, saw the same thing happening with her green-bottle blue tarantula, Miss Dashwood, who also makes chaotic-looking webs, and it prompted her to make this New Year's post on Blue Sky. Miss Dashwood welcomes you to the new year and wants to remind you to follow your creative impulses as much as you can. Your web doesn't need to make sense to anyone else. The next time you're feeling like others don't value whatever it is that makes you who you are, find yourself a black widow and look at that web and remember this. Whether it's the screenplay you're writing, that obscure thing you're obsessed with, or just living authentically as the human being you are, your web doesn't need to make sense to anyone else. And that's where I'll leave this. The black widow is one of the most notorious spiders on the planet, and yet for all of our research, there's still so much we don't know about them. But what we do know amazes me, and I hope it intrigues you too. Of course, an enormous thank you to my patrons, without whom this channel would not be possible. So if you want to support this channel, Patreon is the very best way to do it. I post additional material over there, interesting things I come across while researching, random spider encounters, methods I use in general spidering, also behind the scenes stuff that happens in the making of these videos, and any fun spidery stuff I can think of to put there. There'll be a link in the description, you can go check it out and support my work there. You can also head over to my Shopify store where you can get some channel merch. A lot of you have asked for these, and I finally made them available, so you can head over there and get yourself one while supporting the channel at the same time. And you can also follow me on Blue Sky, which seems to be the place where all the sciencey people went when Twitter became, well, what it became. The next time you see a black widow, take a moment to appreciate these shy, striking spiders. Despite their reputation, we don't need to fear them, and they deserve their place in the world just as we do. So let's work to give these spiders and ourselves the best version of the world that we can. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've learned something about this spider on your house, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers.